You're muted, by the way, Martin.
How's that? How's that?
That's fine. Thank you.
Do I need to start again?
Yes.
Oh. Excuse me. Hello, everybody. Thank you again for your loyalty and your perseverance and patience. As Martin's just said, we're going to finish. I'm going to bump Richard I off today. And I'm not just going to do a hatchet job on him. Hopefully it'll be a kind of balanced view. And then next time it'll be King John, and then we're going to break up for the summer. So, but just bearing in mind that if you were brought up as I was, to think that Richard I was absolutely saint-like, it might come as a bit of a shock to find that he was anything but. So you might think it is a hatchet job, but that's what modern history, or the study of history, is all about. It's digging down past the legends and the reputation that somebody might have had for various reasons, where the bad side of them was hushed up. I mean, it happens today, doesn't it, with politicians? We don't know all about them, or celebrities. We don't know all about them until they fall from grace, and then things kind of emerge from the woodwork, and we find out that they weren't as wonderful as they were made out to be when they were in their prime. And it's particularly true of Richard. We will come back to that. That he was regarded for centuries as an absolutely fantastic role model, particularly for young men. Later, of course, linked with the idea of going and serving the empire. You know, the idea that the crusading zeal and the crusading personality was not dead, still very much alive, going and serving the empire in hot and difficult countries for a greater cause, sacrificing yourself for a greater cause. That had tremendous appeal. And so he was right up there with chocolate for years and years and years. And it's only it's only recently that historians have delved deeper and found out that there is another side to Richard I, as there is to most of us. Not exactly a dark side, but a side that we rather people didn't know about. Only we have found out about Richard because that was just information that was kept, that was hushed up. And it started quite early on with his coronation. 3rd of September 1189, coronation held in Westminster Abbey. And although they were banned from attending, Jews were not allowed in the abbey because they weren't Christian. But some Jewish leaders decided that they would honour the king, and they brought gifts for him on his coronation day. And instead of being allowed to deliver the gifts, they did understand that they couldn't go into the abbey. They knew the rules. They knew they weren't allowed in, but they were going to present them at the abbey door, and hopefully they would be taken into the abbey and presented to the king, and he would be pleased. The exact opposite happened. The Jews were regarded as evil interlopers that were going to ruin the service, and they were grabbed, they were stripped, which was humiliating and horrible, and they were beaten, flogged, which was beaten sometimes to the point of death, and then they were thrown bodily out into the street. They'd gone into a sort of courtyard. They were thrown bodily outside, but they, by that time, I mean, utterly complete humiliation and disgrace for them when they'd meant to do a kind and generous deed. So rumours spread very quickly that the new king had actually ordered Jews to be killed, that was like almost like a practice crusade, kill the non-believers. So Londoners decided that they would take it upon themselves to obey the king, although he hadn't actually sent out a specific order. These were rumours that were circulating that the king didn't like Jews and he'd be doing the king a huge favour if the Jews were dealt with. And so the Londoners decided to attack their Jewish population. Homes were burned, which is a horrible thing to do. And then his supporters came to his rescue and they said, oh no, the king doesn't hate Jews and he doesn't want all this happening right at the beginning of his reign. And it is said that he then distributed a royal writ, which has been discovered, demanding that Jews should be left unmolested. So there's a sort of, right at the beginning of his reign, there was controversy about his actual beliefs and his actions. So the jury's out regarding his attitude to his Jewish subjects. But it is true that the following year, there was a massacre of Jews in York. And the problem was mainly that they were money lenders. We've mentioned this before. They weren't allowed to hold any public office. Jews were not allowed to have the same education as other people. They couldn't go to university. They couldn't, however clever they were, they couldn't hold any university posts. That was true in nearly all the countries in Europe. They couldn't hold any administrative positions. They couldn't be aldermen or councillors or mayors or sheriffs. It was so limited. They couldn't farm, they couldn't own land. That one of the only things left for them was lending money. And as we've said before, Christians were not allowed to lend money and charge interest. They could lend money, but they couldn't charge interest. It was called usury, and it was a sin, absolutely forbidden to Christians. Jews didn't have that restriction, so they were allowed to lend money and charge interest. And so they became traditional money lenders and therefore gained a horrible reputation, because if people owed them money, obviously they didn't enjoy owing money to foreigners. And so the Jews were very, very vulnerable to being attacked, because if you've attacked them or burned their home, you burnt all the records about how much money is owed, then the debt is cancelled. And this happened a great deal. That you set fire to their house, the records have disappeared, or you just attack them and frighten them into not demanding the interest or not calling in the debt, even just being too frightened to do that, even though that was their living. So there was a bit of a blot on the escutcheon of the new king right from the word go, the actual day of his coronation. There had been this what later we called the pogrom. Now he was absolutely determined to go on crusade, and this had been planned years before. He had intended to go crusading with his father, with Henry II, and then of course his father had died. So the preparations were in place. What was he planning to do while he was on crusade? What was he planning to do with his new realm? Well, he'd thought of two people who would be very, very suitable, and he had chosen wisely and well. The Bishop of Durham, Hugh de Puiset, and the Earl of Essex, William de Mandeville. And notice that the names are still French. They are Norman French. And the king never spoke English. He spoke Norman French. We're still in the early days of our medieval kings. They're not really English. They are very, very, they're very French. And you can tell from the names that all the top people still had French names. They were Normans. So William de Mandeville, as soon as he'd been appointed, died and was replaced by William Longchamp, again, French name. And Prince John immediately took against William Longchamp and started conspiring against him. So Prince John is already establishing himself as a bit of a rat. He wants power for himself. He's got a complex. Probably, if he could have written a book, he would have written a book called The Spare. Because he was the baby son, he was the youngest, and he'd always had a chip on his shoulder about being the baby and the youngest and not having any land, and his brothers had teased him and called him John Lackland. You know, and among in the family there'd been a lot of banter, and we don't think John was gifted with a great sense of humour, so I think he'd take too kindly to be teased and laughed about because he hadn't got any land. And when his father tried to make up to him by making Lord of Ireland, you remember that hadn't been a howling success, because John had gone to Ireland and mocked the Irish leaders because they got bare legs and funny, well, he thought funny clothes, and so he laughed at them. So that had been a howling success. So John was a kind of conspirator type person. So sort of built into his personality, that he did things in a kind of sneaky way. I'm not suggesting that Prince Harry does that, but Prince Harry obviously has a large chip on his shoulder for various reasons. So there's Prince John sort of lurking in the background, being not a traitor exactly, but not exactly helping the situation by quarrelling with the person that his brother has left in charge.
The water's there.
Massive fundraising campaign, which is very famous. I don't mention it before, because for our ancestors, it was absolutely the thing that if there'd been news in those days, if there'd been TV news programs, it would have been the first thing on the agenda. This enormous campaign to create enough funds to make the crusade possible. Vast amounts of money donated. Debts to the Jews cancelled. That was fairly standard. They just cancelled the debts. And a tithe tax introduced, tithe coming from the old word, Saxon word tenth. Queen Mother Eleanor started by setting a very good example. She gave part of her great fortune, gained from the fact that she was the Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. And the English contributed more than any other participants, remembering this was going to be a joint effort. And it was a very, very well-funded enterprise, but the taxes went up dramatically. And the interesting thing, as I've mentioned before, is that there wasn't any kind of an uprising, because the English were quite good at complaining about increases in taxation, poll tax, and any increase. They didn't just passively accept it, they usually protested. And that has gone on right through to the present day. Nobody likes paying more taxes unless it is justified in some way. And the justification was, well, we're fighting for Christ. These men are going on our behalf and they're going to fight for Jesus. So our ancestors said, oh, that's all right then, and accepted the huge hike in taxes. Because there was no democracy as such. It's before the days of Parliament. It hadn't been discussed. It was the King's decision. The taxes will go up. And they did massively. And people accepted it because it was in such a good cause, the best cause of all, fighting to release the Holy Land from the Muslims, the non-believers. And Richard is famously, there's a statement attributed to Richard, I would have sold England if I could find a buyer. Some chroniclers recorded that I would have sold London if I could have found a buyer. So there are two versions of that. I would have sold England, which is more dramatic. I would have sold London. And that was to express how important it was for this crusade to go ahead. Some people thought his determination was absolutely wonderful and totally admirable, that he was so focused on getting to the Holy Land and liberating it. And other people, right from the word go, although their opinion wasn't popular, so they didn't voice it very much, thought that he was flagging up neglect of his new realm. That as a new king, new in post, he didn't seem very interested in being King of England. which turned out to be true, as we know. Notoriously, he was king for 10 years, and he spent between 6 and 10 months. It's not absolutely clear how long, but certainly no more than 10 months in England in all that time, which says it all, really. So he saw England as a cash cow. He made that was very clear, that England was a prosperous land, and he just used it to raise money for his crusading enterprise. So this is a kind of saint or sinner debate. Not that he'd done anything evil, but that he wasn't a particularly good king of England. So why is there a statue of him outside the Houses of Parliament? We come back to this question of why is he on a, not just on a pedestal, on a sort of massive high thing, when in fact he got feet of clay. Why I haven't researched that yet, so perhaps some of you would like to sort of dig and find out why the Victorians decided to put him on, have this fantastic statue, which is a splendid statue of him on his horse. I think he's waving a sword right outside the Houses of Parliament. Which seems ridiculous. The Parliament didn't exist in his reign anyway, but you know, he certainly would be. We have the feeling that he probably wouldn't have approved of it if there had been Parliament. He would have sort of fought against it, because they would probably have said, "Hang about. How about you spending a bit more time in your country, your King of England, or how about not requiring quite so much money to go crusading? Let's get the balance right." There wasn't anybody to say that to him, except posterity. We can say it, a bit late, but we can have an opinion about it. But it's the Victorians that put that statue there. It's not contemporary with Richard, so we need to sort of find out really why they thought that was a brilliant idea, because it must have been a very expensive statue. So remember that this crusade wasn't just Richard of England, Richard I. It was the crusade of 3 kings, and Philip Augustus, King of France, and Richard travelled together. They arrived in Sicily and immediately became involved in dynastic disputes, but they were successful in capturing Messina. But another thing about Richard is that he seems to have been rather an awkward customer, because he found it difficult to get on with other people that he was supposed to get on with, i.e. his partners in this crusade. Before they had even left Sicily, the 2 kings were falling out. And it seems from the French side, the French chronicler's view, it was Richard who was the awkward one. I mean, they would say that, wouldn't they? They would say that. They were defending their own monarch. But it's interesting that wherever he went and whatever he did, he seemed to find it difficult to work with other people. He was a leader and he wanted his own way. So sort of come back to that, we'll just sort of flag that up. In April 1191, they left by sea for Acre, the great city of Acre, the great port. But he arrived in Cyprus and again became involved in local disputes. Took over the whole island and later sold it, interestingly, to the master of the Knights Templar. Money, again, being the issue. He wanted money. He needed money for his enterprise. And Cyprus came out of it well. It became a stable Christian feudal kingdom, well governed. That was a success. But that wasn't what he was supposed to be doing. He was supposed to be liberating the Holy Land. And then, before leaving for Acre, Richard married Berengaria. And Berengaria, apart from having the longest name of any of our British English queens, is a kind of a bit of a mystery. She's famous because she married Richard the Lionheart, but they didn't seem to spend very much time together, which did become an issue. It was an arranged marriage, but then most marriages of royalty and rich people were arranged in those days. That was standard. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, had been very key player in this arranged marriage. And it was gossip started rather early on in the marriage that Richard didn't really seem to want to spend much time with his wife. Were they incompatible, or was there another reason? That reason has come to the did actually come to the surface at the time, but was hushed up, and then was hushed up for centuries, and then came to life again last century, in the 20th century. Was Richard gay? Again, the jury is out, but there are strong indications that yes, he was, or he was bisexual. The interesting thing is that he did have an illegitimate child. So it's a little bit difficult to track this one and come to a conclusion. But the idea that he was newly married, he just didn't seem to be very interested in spending time with his bride. She spent an awful lot of time with her mother-in-law. But the mother-in-law had actually set up the marriage. So poor Berengaria is seen historically as a rather tragic figure, that her marriage didn't really go anywhere or do anything, and they were childless. The whole idea of royal marriages in those days is that they would produce offspring, particularly male offspring, to secure the succession. So it was a childless marriage, and there's this question mark over why didn't Richard want to spend more time with his wife. So they landed at Acre in June this month, in 1191, a key port held by Saladin and the Turks, of course. Richard fell ill with a mystery disease, which was later described as being like scurvy, which is interesting, because it's a vitamin deficiency illness. And again, famously, as a great war leader and commander and general and inspiration for his troops, even though he was really ill and couldn't walk and was being carried on a stretcher, and the stretcher's all described as covered in a rich silken quilt, posh quilt, because he was the king. Even though he was weak and couldn't walk, his arms apparently still worked, because he was still using a crossbow and shooting at at guards on the harbour walls at Acre, which still exist, massive solid walls. Excuse me. And guards that were patrolling were therefore exposed to enemy fire, and Richard was firing a crossbow, and crossbows are not all that easy to fire if you're lying on a stretcher, even though he was apparently propped up with silken cushions. And that's another piece of evidence that was sort of travelled around Europe. You know, what a fantastic man. You know, he's so weak and he's lying on a stretcher, but he's still firing, he's still defending, you know, still trying to capture Acre. How fantastic he is. Another piece of propaganda, if you like, although there's no doubt that it did happen. He was obviously very impatient of being ill, you know, hated it. But also giving an example to his troops, which good commanders do. You know, don't give in just because there's a little problem. Look at me, I'm lying on the stretcher, still fighting. So Richard falls out again with Leopold of Austria, the third in this Three Kings setup. It's interesting how many times he falls out with people. Fell out with Leopold after they'd captured Acre, which was a huge triumph, but it was a siege, the famous siege of Acre. So siege warfare was a very specific form of warfare in the Middle Ages. You surrounded the town or city that you were trying to capture with the idea of starving them out. You didn't let food in. And eventually, it would probably take months, they would run out of food and they would hand over their keys, which was the formal act of surrender. The keys to the great gates, which all medieval cities had in those days. keys to the gate. The walls are walled cities with gates. So if you handed over the keys, that was the sign that you had surrendered. So you might have to wait a long time for them to run out of food. But if you waited patiently, they would also get plague. They would also get all sorts of things wrong as their food supplies dwindled. They would start eating anything like rats and things, and then they would get ill. Well, hopefully that's what people hoped, that they would get ill and then surrender. The problem with sieges is that the people sitting outside also had problems getting food and water. And because of, there weren't any flushing loos or anything, and there weren't even any decent latrines, they just dug holes, a bit like cats. They just dug holes. And they, obviously, if people are in the same area for a long time, there is going to be a problem with human waste disposal. And disease always broke out. It always ended up with everybody getting, well, not everybody, but people getting typhus and typhoid and dysentery. And dysentery was the curse of medieval armies. So it was very often the siege ended not with victory for the people sitting outside besieging. It ended up with the people being besieged winning, because the besieging army was so ill that they had to give up, they had to retreat, they had to go away and desperately to find some food and bury their dead, because people would be dying in great numbers. So the siege of Acre is famous because they were attacking as well, as they were combining, trying to starve them out and attacking. And finally, this great fortress fell to the Crusaders, an absolute massive success. But in the meantime, it quarrelled with Philip Augustus, King of France. It quarrelled with Leopold of Austria. Philip of France went home. And it ended up being, instead of the Crusade of Three Kings, or the Venture of Three Kings, it became one king, our king, which again fits in with the people who are writing this up and the propaganda. He was the only one determined enough to keep going. The others were wimps. They went home, which wasn't quite the truth. It wasn't, the spin doctors in those days, just as there are now, spinning the circumstances to make them look good. So it looked very good for Richard, the only one left standing, the only one still determined enough, despite having been ill. What a trooper, what a wonderful man. So next blot on his copybook. Richard had kept, and the very specific numbers, 2,700 Muslim prisoners as hostages. This was very commonplace in, well, warfare generally, but particularly in medieval times. Take prisoners hostage in order to gain an advantage over your enemy and say, well, if you don't do what we're asking you to do, then it's going to be curtains for these prisoners. We're taking them as hostage. And they knew that they were being kept for a specific reason. According to the code of chivalry, if you took people prisoner and they'd surrendered their weapons, then you should treat them as civilians. You should give them food and water and shelter, and even offer them medical aid if necessary. And that's part of the Geneva Convention. It's sort of, just in different words, that prisoners are to be treated humanely. And that was part of the code of chivalry. So women, children, members of the clergy, any clergy of any religion, non-combatants, and people who'd surrendered their weapons should be treated with dignity and not attacked. So these Muslim prisoners have been taken hostage to ensure that Saladin kept his promise to relinquish all the land around Acre to the Christian conquerors. Not just Acre, the actual city, but the land around it. Well, then the army needed to move closer to Jerusalem, which was the whole idea of the crusade really was to liberate Jerusalem. And Richard then, the king, then found the 2,700 prisoners, well, a nuisance. What was he going to do with them? Carry on feeding them and giving them water? Water was scarce. So he ordered them all to be killed. So that was totally against the code of chivalry. They're executed. Some people said good. The only good Muslim is a dead Muslim, that sort of argument. Who cares what happens to them? They're infidels, they're non-believers. We've come to fight the Muslims. So all right, you've killed them, you've done a good thing. God will be pleased with you. Other people say, no, they haven't got any weapons, they couldn't defend themselves. What happened to the code of chivalry? So another blot on Richard's wonderful reputation. It's also known that he had a very bad temper. That was beginning to emerge, that he was very impatient and very, very angry when things didn't go his way. You know, a really, really horrible temper. And that he could be very impetuous. So people are beginning to look at him rather warily, not quite the person they thought he was. So, but he believed, and he had what he thought of as proof that God was favouring him and his enterprise, because a few months later, massive victory at a place called Arsuf. The Crusaders were winning. They were winning big time. So obviously God approved of what Richard had done. No other explanation for it. Then, when they reached Beit Nuba, which was only 12 miles from Jerusalem, if you climbed a hill, you could see Jerusalem clearly. The weather changed. We tend to think it's incredibly hot in the Middle East all the time. Well, and it isn't. But this particular weather change was very, very dramatic. It suddenly turned cold and wet and rainy, more like England, very unexpectedly, heavy rainstorms and even hailstorms, which were, you know, really unusual. And the decision was made to march back to the coast. It was a complex decision, that they would regroup. It wasn't that they'd given up, not at all. They hadn't given up on capturing Jerusalem. It just didn't seem appropriate at that particular time. They would wait for the weather to settle down. They were having food problems, feeding the troops, and horses, of course, remembering that many of the Crusaders were cavalry. We tend to forget. Horses were the sort of tanks and machines at the time. They need to be fed and watered. Not to keep on riding a horse, not intending to eat, it's going to collapse, and many horses did. They collapsed of heat stroke. So again, it's the unexpected. It's the fact that they were running out of provisions. So they decided that they would go back to the coast and think about this and think of a more appropriate and suitable time to attack Jerusalem. And so in June 1192, they made another attempt to liberate Jerusalem. And this failed because of arguments among the leaders. This is interesting again, that although Richard gets praised for being a fantastic leader and general and so forth, arguments. He wanted his own way, always. And he didn't listen to advice, apparently. So we say he was sort of willful and arrogant, and these are sort of negatives. And then it all turned into just arguing that there were skirmishes. There was a battle. There was a successful battle, the Battle of Jaffa or Joppa. King Richard always had the reputation for being an incredibly courageous soldier, leading his armies, leading a successful and courageous general, leading his armies, not just giving orders and as some generals did and still do, perhaps. Giving orders but not actually being totally involved or risking their own lives. Far from that, he led his armies, and he then heard very troubling news that Brother John was causing trouble in England. Once again, this big chip on his shoulder had come to the fore. Why had his brother Richard not trusted him as regent? They didn't use the word regent then, but we know what that means, so we'll use the word regent. why hadn't Brother Richard left the kingdom in his charge? Well, we know why. Because John was unreliable, and baby brother. So, Richard had grown up thinking of John as the wayward baby brother, and he left the kingdom in excellent hands, but John was causing trouble, big time. This is where the legend of Robin Hood comes in. If you remember your Robin Hood stories, that while Richard was away, John was causing all sorts of trouble and was in cahoots with the wicked Sheriff of Nottingham. And then, just as things were reaching sort of boiling point, Richard appears dramatically wearing his Crusader outfit. So I remember I've got several books about Robin Hood, and there's always this dramatic entrance where Richard suddenly appears and he's got a cloak over his Crusader outfit, and people don't know who this tall, handsome stranger is, and suddenly he sort of whips off his cloak and reveals his surcoat, with a white surcoat with the big red cross on it, and everybody goes, "Oh, it's the king! He's come back from the Holy Land and caught us all rebelling and doing terrible things, all except Robin Hood and his merry men. But Sheriff of Nottingham and Prince John are just being so evil," and it's all very dramatic and it's all very legendary, and it didn't actually happen. Because if there was a Robin Hood, he lived a lot later. There is some evidence of somebody called Robin le Hood, spelled Hode, in the reign of Edward II, which is the early 14th century. So we're not there yet. So this is what happens with legends, as I'm sure you know. They can be sort of transplanted and people can be moved around. I think I mentioned it before, a little bit like the legends of St. George. You probably remember a few years ago, somebody did a lot of research trying to find the true historical St. George, and coming up with very little in terms of who he really was. Very little known about the real St. George. But the number of stories about him, and the little golden book of St. George was read to our ancestors, or it was used by the priests if they couldn't read. After the Black Death, a lot of priests couldn't read. There was a kind of crash course in priesthood because there was such an emergency after the Black Death. That a lot of the priests had been, well, really, it was a bit like after the war when they trained a lot of teachers and they only did 1 year's training, and then because there was so few, there was a crisis. And after the Black Death, that's what happened with priests. But what they did learn, probably off by heart, was the different ways in which the authorities tried to kill St. George, because it was very exciting. 7 different ways. I can't remember them all in order, but they tried to saw him in half, and the saw went all wobbly. The blade of the saw went all wobbly. They tried to drown him. That happened with a lot of stories about saints. They tried to drown them, and the pool or the river dried up mysteriously and miraculously. They tried to stab him to death, and the sword went all like jelly. Wouldn't stab. I think they tried to poison him, and the poison didn't work. And there were 7 different ways, and of course it gets more and more exciting. And the story of the dragon is clearly Perseus and Andromeda and the dragon, the maiden tied to the rock, and Perseus coming to the rescue. So the church actually borrowed a lot of legends and stories from Roman and Greek mythology to enhance the drama and make the saint even more saintly, that because they were saints, normal ways of killing them wouldn't work. So this is really what happened to Robin Hood. Robin Hood did exist and was possibly an outlaw, and possibly lived in Sherwood Forest. But all the other legends about him, and certainly this connection with King Richard coming back and congratulating Robin Hood as if a king would congratulate an outlaw, it's all been made up, and it makes an absolutely cracking story, absolutely wonderful, but incredibly legendary. And it is true that Prince John was conspiring against his brother. That's not legendary. That's true. It was sort of in his genes somehow that he couldn't be loyal. He wanted some sort of authority and recognition for himself. But there was trouble in England, and a lot of it was caused by brother John. So Richard thought that at this point, knowing that he'd almost reached Jerusalem and that he'd won great victories, so it's just a question of going back and finishing the job, he thought he should go home and see what was going on in England. And Philip of France, far from being an ally, had now turned against Richard and was trying to take some of the land in Aquitaine, taking the Angevin inheritance. So Richard had a lot on his hands, apart from just the crusade. He was sort of guarding his territory and dealing with a possible uprising in favour of Prince John in England. So he had a lot of fish to fry. And in September, King Richard and Saladin made an agreement. A 3-year truce. 3 years is a long time. 3-year truce. Christian pilgrims and merchants were guaranteed access to the Holy City. Muslim fortifications at Ascalon to be dismantled. And Richard left for England, having made this agreement with Saladin. And strangely, he's not given very much credit for that because it wasn't fighting. Our ancestors seem to think it had got to be on the battlefield, a victory on the battlefield, before they recognised it as something great, before Richard got the credit. Whereas we, thinking differently nowadays, think he should have more credit for reaching some kind of not exactly a peace treaty, but certainly a very good agreement. Yeah, Martin's saying rapprochement. Yes, that's a very good word, a rapprochement. Doesn't get credit for that. We give him credit now, because that was a very good solution to the problem. It wasn't a permanent solution, but 3 years is a long time. They could have said 6 months. 3 years. So we now need to think about Saladin. Saladin has got a really good reputation. And in one of the books I read, it actually said that Saladin deserves, actually from his behaviour, his personality, his actions, has a better reputation than the King of England. That Saladin was a sultan, he was a Kurd, but he was Sultan of Egypt. And when he died in his part of the world, he was acknowledged as a great man with a great personality, a man of his word. He treated his Christian prisoners with enormous respect. No question of killing them because they were inconvenient, although at times they obviously were, feeding and looking after a lot of people that are actually your enemy. But he behaved with enormous respect. He actually respected Christians, although they were the enemy. It was about land rather than faith. He didn't hate Christians. Some Muslims did, but he didn't. Richard found a picture. Saladin, a benevolent man respected by both Muslims and Christians. And on one occasion, when Richard was ill with a very high fever, Saladin actually sent his enemy some iced fruit. And I used to think, where on earth did he get ice from? In the Middle East, it's hot all the time. Well, we've just proved it isn't. I mean, there were hailstones. It isn't hot all the time. And what they do is hide there when there is some ice. They hide it in caves, and so it doesn't melt. But it's very rare. So sending anybody iced fruit was the most generous of gifts, because ice was so hard to keep, of course, in such a hot climate. So to send your enemy something lovely because he's ill is more the sort of thing you'd expect Richard to be doing, but he didn't. It was Saladin who actually sent the fruit. So Saladin actually, within his own community and the Muslim world and in the Christian world at the time, has a very good reputation as a cultured man with very fine principles, following the Muslim code, which is in the Quran, that you should treat prisoners well, etc., etc. So they've got their own code of chivalry. And so he comes out of this very well. Well, the next exciting thing, I mean, this is very much like a soap opera, is that Richard, bad weather led to shipwreck in the Mediterranean. It's like this is a roller coaster of events. It's like things are going badly now for Richard. They've been going really well. The capture of Acre, absolutely fantastic. But now things are going badly. So because they were shipwrecked, they had to go over the land route through Central Europe. And he was captured near Vienna by Leopold of Austria, who had been his ally. So this is interesting. He now disliked Richard to the point where he'd taken him prisoner. Instead of saying, oh no, I'm going to give you assistance to get back to your own country, thought, right, this is a fine prize. I can ransom him. I can make money out of him. So obviously no love lost. They were allies, and now suddenly they're not allies at all. So Leopold of Austria captures Richard and puts him in a prison, in a castle, of course, on the Danube, called Dornstein Castle. We did one of the famous Viking river cruises down the Danube, and one of the places that we went as tourists was to Dornstein. So a lot of climbing, and it was a hot day, a lot of climbing to reach this castle, which is fantastic, in a fantastic position, high on a kind of cliff. And while he was there, again, famously, Richard, who was cultured, he was very musical, and he could write poetry. And so he combined the two. He wrote poetry and then set the poetry to poems to music. And he spent his time being a composer, really. And this is when the famous legend occurred of Blondel, who was the court minstrel, going from castle to castle with his lute, playing a song which he and Richard had composed together, and only Richard would be able to sing the melody. So Blondel, in the legend, goes to different castles because nobody knew where Richard was. And so they needed to find out. So Blondel sort of volunteered to go around all the castles, stand outside, play his lute, sing this song, and wait for an answering voice to sing the chorus or finish if he only did half a verse, to join in and finish the verse off. Only the king would be able to do that. So this famous legend of Blondel sort of trotting around all the castles in Austria took on. People thought, oh, wonderful idea! What a star! What a wonderful chap this Blondel must be. Unfortunately, when we went to Dornstein, the guide there sort of poured a lot of cold water on this legend and said it probably never actually took place. It's a wonderful story, but probably didn't happen. But he said, and he laughed and said, you know, you will go to the gift shop and there will be pictures of pottery things of the castle, pottery design things for the castle, and Blondel outside, and the king leaning out of the window, sort of waving at him, sort of, hi, I'm here. I know that I'm just the chorus, so I am the King of England. You found me. Well done. So he said, take no notice of those because it is legendary. The other interesting thing about Dornstein was that it's quite a village, really, not even a town. Lots and lots of shops for tourists. old buildings, very nice. The thing they were selling, rather more than Richard the Lionheart being imprisoned there, was apricots. Every shop we went to, it was apricot liquor, apricot jam, apricot drinks, apricot things, all coloured apricot. You walked in the shop, it was all orange. They're absolutely obsessed with selling us lots of apricots in different forms. And we went from shop to shop because I like apricots, but I'd got enough apricot jam and whatever at home. Didn't particularly want to buy any more. Really wanted to buy something about King Richard. We went from shop to shop, down one side and back the other side. Apricots, solid. Paintings of apricots and photographs of apricots. Never quite got to the bottom of that because our guide didn't seem to know. We're just laughing about it and saying, well, have you all indulged in buying lots of apricot products? And we all shook our heads, no. Very strange. So that's what I remember about Dornstein, the very big climb to get to the castle, and then apricots in the shops, and the debunking of the great story of Blondel the minstrel, the faithful minstrel going from castle to castle, singing to try and find out in which dungeon his master was being held. And then the king was moved to many other castles, and a huge ransom, an absolutely ridiculous ransom, was being demanded by Leopold of Austria. 2 to 3 times the annual income for the English crown, the revenue for what later became the Exchequer. A ridiculous amount. And again, Queen Eleanor, Queen Mother, full of action, full of energy, as she'd always been, launches herself into crowdfunding, if you like it to be called today. We must raise this ransom. We mustn't try and negotiate about it. We must get out. My son must be released. What are we going to do? We're going to somehow collect the ransom money. So, once again, demand for money from our ancestors. So they'd only just funded the crusade, getting over the huge hike in taxes, and now they're being asked for more money to get the king out of prison. So clergy and lay people were taxed for a quarter of the value of their property. There was a lot of muttering about that, well, more than muttering, loud complaints that the church was being hammered. Gold, silver church treasures were ruthlessly removed and melted down to create coinage. And once again, the Jews were forced to surrender money, and this huge ransom, £100,000 of silver, was produced in record time. Absolutely amazing. Historians have attributed that to the fact that we had such a good system in place, that we had one of the best and most efficient systems in Europe from the point of view of collecting taxes, collecting money, and that is proof, because it was done in record time. It was quite amazing. And so Leopold of Austria gets his money and the king is released. And King Philip of France then sent this famous message to Prince John, with whom he had been conspiring in cahoots with Prince John. Look to yourself, the devil is loose. So Prince John suddenly sort of woke up and discovered that his brother, who he thought was safely confined in Austria, is on his way back to England and will find out all the terrible things that Prince John has been up to in his absence. So, but he forgave his brother. Interesting thing. So this is again the good side of Richard, that he forgave his brother. Many people were thinking he deserved to be killed as a traitor, but no, forgave him. So the next thing on the agenda, rather than recapturing Jerusalem, was temporarily put on the back burner, and the reconquest of Normandy was required because the Angevin Empire and the Norman Empire were just being nibbled away. Well, not nibbled, were being taken away while the king was distracted, while he was thinking about the crusade. While the cat's away, the mice will play. The Angevin Empire was under attack, and the original Norman territories were under attack. So the king left for the continent once again, leaving Hubert Walter, who had a very good reputation, the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was left as what we would call regent. All these appointments had turned out to be very successful. So another thing that was praiseworthy about Richard was that he was a good chooser of men. He was wise in that regard. He chose good people to look after this country during his absence. And Martin's found put an inset in your notes about Hubert Walter, a great administrator. His position in church and state was unmatched until the time of Cardinal Wolsey in the 16th century. We would call him a prime minister today, but that post did not exist. But we would say prime minister or chancellor, sort of in charge. Now, the last 5 years of Richard's life, obviously didn't know he'd only got 5 years left. One of the things he was very interested in was castle design. And one of his fantastic achievements was Chateau Gaillard. He called it his child. I mean, he hadn't got it. Well, he got one illegitimate child. He had no children by his wife. Chateau Gaillard was his baby, his child, his jewel. He openly praised the castle as a great achievement because it incorporated all the latest knowledge about fortification, keeping the enemy out, keeping the people, the garrison happy, plenty of water, etc. And it still exists. Chateau Gaillard is and there are photographs. Martin's found photographs of this fantastic castle, which incorporated all the latest thinking in terms of clever portcullises, etc., and double walls instead of just one wall. And what would happen if people climbed over the walls and got into the castle? All sorts of things that were state of the art at the time, all incorporated and it wasn't the only castle, but that's the one that has survived and was the largest of the castles that Richard built or caused to be built. Now, his death was also dramatic. I mean, his whole life was dramatic. He didn't do anything ordinary, or everything was sort of dramatic and interesting. His death was mourned more than it would normally been if he'd been killed sort of actually crusading, because it was unnecessary. He sort of threw his life away it wasn't just unnecessary, it pointed out, it was the kind of thing you could argue either way. Either he threw his life away and that was a foolish thing to do, and it was because he was stubborn and because he was showing off and because he wouldn't listen to advice. All of these are bad, all of these are negatives. Or you could say he was supremely brave and a risk taker, and that what he did was good. You can argue it either way. So what happened was the Viscount, we say Viscount, Vicomte of Limoges had come into the ownership of a large amount of gold, a hoard of gold. It had been discovered by accident by a peasant who was ploughing and found this gold hidden and surrendered it, of course, to his overlord, the Viscount, we'll say Viscount of Limoges. So there was this large amount of treasure. It was often described as treasure trove, because it had been in the ground and it had been discovered by accident. And Richard then decided that it was his. It was on his territory and he wanted it. And the Viscount refused to surrender it. Said, no, it's on my territory. I found, it's found on my territory, so I'm keeping it. And Richard said, oh, no, you're not. I want it. Hand it over. No. Right. I'm going to take it by force then. So in a way, it was a trivial thing. And showing the king not at his best, being rather petulant and it's mine, I want it, almost childish. And when he was denied it, it was, you know, instead of saying, oh, all right, then, or we'll negotiate or give me part of it, no negotiation. It was very, right, you've disobeyed me. I'm coming in all guns blazing sort of thing. I'm coming to take what is rightly mine. The Viscount said, no, it isn't, it's mine. It was all ridiculous. They should have resolved it. But because of Richard's personality, he didn't like being thwarted, and sort of arrogant and defiant and willful, all these issues. He decided he was going to get what was rightfully his. He was told to stay out of sight, partly because he was the king, and partly because, well, they would have said it to anybody. Don't expose yourself to being killed by a sniper. Don't walk about on the where you could be hit. You are the king. You're precious. You know, we're trying to look after you. Do as you're told. Well, that was anathema to Richard. He never did as he was told. He hated being given advice. He was the one that gave advice to other people. He was in charge. So he didn't listen to the advice. And as a result, a sniper managed to catch him in the shoulder with a well-aimed arrow in the shoulder. So it wasn't a death blow. It wasn't going to kill him. It was in an awkward place, but it certainly, he didn't even bleed very much, apparently. Unfortunately, the guy that was acting as the medico wasn't very experienced in removing arrows from people when it had landed in a kind of quite an awkward place underneath the sort of at the top of his arm. So it hadn't done massive amounts of damage, but it wasn't a question of just pulling it straight out. Well, this guy did try to just pull. He just pulled, shafted the arrow, pulled, and the shaft of the arrow came out and left the arrowhead behind. He should have used a scalpel, or he should have opened the wound and dug the arrowhead out. That was the standard practice. But this chap didn't seem to know that. He just pulled, and the arrow came apart and left the arrowhead in place. And the king then intervened and said, no, he didn't want people digging around. It was fine. It was, then he went all macho and, you know, it's all right, it doesn't really hurt. Because they didn't know anything about germs in those days. They didn't know really anything about infections, although they were always getting infections. But they didn't really understand the link between, well, they didn't know about germs, they didn't know about bacteria. And this arrowhead started to cause trouble. And then they called somebody in who did know how to dig arrowheads out. But by that time, it had gone really septic. And they tried to dig the arrowhead out and sort of made the situation worse. And as a result, the king got gangrene. And that was what killed him. So it wasn't necessary for him to die of getting an arrow stuck into his, it wasn't in the outside of his shoulder, it was sort of at the top of his, the inner arm, and quite an awkward place. And that's why they hadn't want to sort of started digging. That the king didn't want to lose the use of that arm, and that's what he feared. If somebody that didn't quite know what they were doing started digging around, he wanted a proper surgeon. But even the surgeons at the time, of course, weren't anything like surgeons today. So he died of gangrene. Not a noble death. You know, he didn't die of an arrow having gone into his heart. He died unnecessarily. He shouldn't have been walking about where he could get shot. He'd been warned and warned and warned, and he defiantly took no notice. And it was really a medical mishap, and therefore it wasn't a glorious, a wonderful death in Jerusalem, which is what he'd hoped for. To die gloriously, fighting for his, if he had to die, that he would like to die in Jerusalem, fighting valiantly for Christ. So he died very bravely. And then again, it's sort of good King Richard. He sent for the guy that the archer that had effectively killed him and forgave him. What a lovely thing to do. So King Richard's reputation is sort of up and down, back and forth, bit of a roller coaster, good things, bad things, quarrelling with people, on the other hand, people being fanatically loyal to him. It's very difficult to reach a sort of balanced conclusion about King Richard. But the mourning that took place was profound. So he was buried, not in this country, of course, but in France, Pontrevaux. And as was customary in those days, he was somewhat dismembered, which to us seems strange. His heart was buried in Rouen Cathedral, and his mummified heart survived and has been examined, and all sorts of things happened to it, which he wouldn't have liked. And his entrails were buried at Chaillot. That was also customary, and to us seems weird. Why would you have all your intestines buried somewhere else? Well, that was just the way it was. His legacy is very controversial, as we just proved. Historians are still in conflict. They still can't quite decide whether he's a good guy or a bad guy. But one conclusion is definite, and that is that his enemy Saladin was far more chivalrous than King Richard was, and deserved his fine reputation. Nobody has undermined Saladin, although they tried. And Richard definitely had a dark side, like killing those prisoners and his attitude to the Jews and his quarrelling. It didn't seem to be able to stay friends with people. His allies quickly found there's another side to him. So the dark side has definitely been airbrushed out of later accounts of his life. And he was seen as an absolutely wonderful role model, and placed on a pedestal. I mean, literally, when they made the statue of him, that nobody was allowed to say anything. With the idea that he might be gay, that was certainly hushed up. Although he was cautioned and reprimanded by very important church leaders after his marriage, that said he must spend more time with his wife and he must do penance for neglecting her, which is very unusual. Why do penance for neglecting his wife? What were they getting at exactly? And that is one of the areas that's been investigated. And he then had to do penance again. Church leaders again sort of ganged up on him and said, why aren't you spending more time with your wife? And there is other evidence as well, which I won't go into, but he's a mysterious character, from being, having a Ladybird book written up just about him, Richard the Lionheart. Oh, and another legend, famous legend, that he was called Richard the Lionheart because on one occasion, when he was in Syria, a lion attacked him, and he managed to disengage the lion and put his hand down its throat. His mouth was open to bite him. And instead of it biting him, Richard plunged his hand right down its throat. And I mean, anatomically, this is very incorrect, got hold of its heart and pulled its heart out, thereby killing lion and showing that he was Richard the Lionheart. And the pictures that show a proper lion, a proper African lion, which it wouldn't have been. It would have been a mountain lion, which is just the size of a large dog. So even in his own lifetime, powerful legends were being promulgated and circulating about how fantastically brave he was. Now, if you did put your hand down a lion's throat, you wouldn't find its heart. So it's anatomically not very accurate, but then legends aren't. But there were pictures of him actually wrestling with the lion. And that's the sort of thing that comes from Greek and Roman myths. Somebody who could overpower snakes and lions and dragons, etc. So what happened to Richard was that he attracted a lot of sensational stories to add to the legend of what a fantastic king he was. But now we're thinking he did have a dark side. He was an ordinary human being with tremendous courage when necessary, and the advantage that he had been fighting for Christ. So that gave him about 1 million brownie points before anyone even started judging him as a king of England. As a king of England, he doesn't come out of it terribly well. We might give him 2 out of 10. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Judy. As usual, fascinating. I'm reminded, because I'd done the notes and typed them up, when I was watching television last night, there was a documentary about Edward VIII.
Oh yeah, watch that.
And he had a doubtful sexual reputation, as well as his evil that was revealed by documents that they've at last uncovered. If you didn't see it, Judy says it's well,
very, very good.
Well worth watching. It's
The Traitor King.
Yes.
And again, somebody who fell off a pedestal. He was a wonderful Prince of Wales, everybody said.
Well, he visited all the miners. And
everybody said how good he'd been. And then all this comes out later, the other side. The fact that it was, well, the Traitor King, he was called, he's called the Traitor King because he wanted an artist to win. So it is worth watching. It's very interesting.
It certainly revised and added to my knowledge. It was fascinating. Anyhow, we're not doing that bit yet. We may get to it eventually.
Probably not, no.
No, because Judy always stops in the 20s. Thank you for support.
Yeah.
We gather again Monday week for the last session before the summer break. Thank you very much.
Stay well.
Thank you. Thank you, Judy.